Let's jump right into this explainer. This is your ultimate roadmap to mastering restorative justice for the AQA A-Level Psychology exam. If you've been staring at point 12 on your syllabus, you know, the one dealing with offending behavior, and wondering how on earth to structure your essays for those top band marks, well, you're in exactly the right place. We're going to unpack this whole victim-centered approach and hit every single requirement you need.
Here's what we're covering today. First, AO1, understanding restorative justice. Then, also for AO1, shaming and the process. After that, we'll hit AO2 with real-world applications and psychological theory links. Finally, we'll tackle AO3 by evaluating the approach and then evaluating specific studies using the GRAVE criteria. Let's get to it. Kicking things off with Section 1, AO1, understanding restorative justice and building that foundational knowledge. The absolutely crucial thing here is starting with our AO1 bucket. We need to nail down what this concept actually is to give examiners exactly what they're looking for.
So let's establish our core definition. Restorative justice shifts the focus way away from traditional retribution. You know, the whole idea of just locking someone up and throwing away the key. Instead, it strongly prioritizes active responsibility and community healing. It's truly a victim-centered approach. It frames crime not just as breaking some arbitrary law, but as a relational harm between real people. It's all about meaningful communication. The offender actually has to confront the very real human impact of what they've done, and the victim finally gets a voice to express how they've been hurt. Now, it's super important to remember that restorative justice isn't just a one-size-fits-all program. It actually takes several forms depending on the severity of the crime and, of course, the safety needs of everyone involved. First, we have victim-offender mediation, which is a direct, facilitated meeting. But we also have restorative conferences that can bring in family and community members, or community restorative panels for less severe crimes, and crucially, shuttle mediation. This one is vital when face-to-face contact just isn't safe or if it's simply not wanted by the victim. A trained mediator literally shuttles messages back and forth. It ensures communication still happens, but totally avoids the risk of re-traumatization.
Moving on to Section 2, AO1, shaming in the process and the psychology behind the meetings. What's really fascinating here is the specific psychological theory and the highly structured process that actually makes these programs work. Like, why does just sitting down and talking change an offender's behavior?
Well, this brilliantly illustrates John Braithwaite's 1989 theory of shaming, which is literally the psychological bedrock of restorative justice. Braithwaite distinguished between two main types of societal responses to crime. First, there's disintegrative shaming. This is what traditional justice typically does. It completely condemns the person, slapping them with the label of criminal. This just leads to stigma and exclusion, and it often pushes them right back into deviant subcultures because society has completely rejected them. Restorative justice, on the other hand, relies on reintegrative shaming. Here, we absolutely condemn the behavior. We don't minimize the crime at all, but we do not condemn the person. By separating the two, we encourage forgiveness and reparation, which helps offenders repair relationships and actually reintegrate into the community.
To pull off that reintegrative shaming safely, a typical meeting follows 6 very strict stages. It doesn't just happen organically, it is heavily structured. It starts with a preparation phase where emotional stability and safety are absolutely prioritized through separate interviews. If the facilitator feels both parties aren't ready, the meeting just doesn't happen. Assuming it does, ground rules are set, the victim shares their incredibly powerful narrative, the offender responds, and then they collaboratively discuss how to fix the harm. It all culminates in Step 6, a concrete agreement and reparation plan. This could be anything from financial compensation to community work. That brings us to Section 3. AO2, real-world applications. This is about bringing theory to life. Let's see how this translates into those precious AO2 marks by applying this framework to real scenarios. This is exactly where you prove to the examiner that you truly understand how this works in practice.
Consider the case of Daniel. He's a 19-year-old who committed a domestic burglary while intoxicated. He severely damaged a woman's home and left her absolutely terrified. Daniel agreed to a restorative conference. During their face-to-face meeting, the victim explained how she completely lost her sense of security and couldn't even sleep. Daniel, who had literally just chosen her house at random, had to sit right there and absorb that immense human cost. He became visibly emotional and took active responsibility for his actions. They eventually agreed to a concrete reparation plan: 50 hours of unpaid work physically repairing the garden wall he broke, alongside completing a victim awareness course.
And his response perfectly captures the emotional stakes of AO2. He later said hearing his victim speak hit me harder than any sentence.
This beautifully highlights how restorative justice promotes genuine empathy. It aggressively challenges an offender's cognitive distortions in a way that just sitting in a prison cell almost always fails to achieve. It completely humanizes the consequences of what they've done.
We can also see this applied way outside the traditional criminal justice system. Take Aisha and Leanne's school dispute. It was an assault that basically sparked from a lunchroom argument. It actually started with shuttle mediation because Aisha was way too frightened to meet face-to-face. But it eventually progressed to a full conference where Leanne explained she was lashing out because of severe stress at home. Together, they co-created a reparation plan. This perfectly illustrates the incredible power of early intervention and relational repair. It stops youth conflict right in its tracks, before it escalates into the formal justice system. Moving to Section 4, AO2 Psychological Theory Links and Connecting the Syllabus. To really maximize those AO2 marks and demonstrate a brilliant, holistic understanding of psychology, we have to cross-link restorative justice to the other major psychological theories you studied in the course.
Let's map this out. First up, social learning theory. Restorative justice intentionally surrounds the offender with pro-social models. You have facilitators and victims actively demonstrating calm, assertive communication instead of aggression. It also fundamentally shifts differential reinforcement. Instead of getting high fives from deviant peers for committing a crime, they're facing direct disapproval from the victim, which is what changes their behavior. Secondly, cognitive theories. This approach acts almost exactly like the cognitive restructuring you'd find in CBT. It forcefully interrupts cognitive distortions, like minimization or hostile attribution bias. When an offender is sitting there hearing a victim crying about their trauma, they just can no longer minimize the crime as just a bit of fun. It also pushes their moral reasoning from a pre-conventional level where they're just trying to avoid punishment up to conventional moral reasoning where they actually recognize they hurt someone and that it was objectively wrong.
Now for Section 5, AO3, Evaluating the Approach. This is where we do the critical analysis for those top marks. Let's dive right into our AO3 bucket, where we judge the effectiveness and the very real limitations of this approach. This is your chance to really show off those critical thinking skills. The emotional empowerment it provides for victims is undoubtedly a massive strength. Studies consistently show super high victim satisfaction because they actually regain a sense of control and find closure. It also genuinely fosters empathy, and for certain specific offenses, meta-analyses show it actually reduces reoffending. However, we absolutely must balance that against its severe limitations. Restorative justice is incredibly unsafe and totally inappropriate for cases involving domestic violence, coercive control, or severe power imbalances. Doing it in those situations risks severely re-traumatizing the victim. There's also a major risk of superficial compliance. Sometimes, offenders are literally just playing along to get a reduced sentence. Finally, it is incredibly resource-intensive. You need highly trained facilitators and careful screening, which makes it really hard to implement broadly in justice systems that are already overstretched.
And finally, Section 6, Evaluating Studies with GRAVE, Seeing Research Methods in Action. For this last part, we're going to evaluate the core empirical studies backing restorative justice, specifically using the GRAVE criteria. It's just a fantastic framework to structure your research methods evaluation.
Just let this number sink in for a second. 36. That is the number of individual studies analyzed in Sherman and Strang's massive, landmark 2007 systematic review of restorative justice programs worldwide. It is absolutely the gold standard study that you need to be referencing in your exams. Breaking this massive study down with the GRAVE framework, we see incredibly high generalizability. They pulled data from 4 different nations: the UK, Australia, Canada, and the US, covering everything from youth offending right up to violent crime. The reliability is super strong thanks to their use of experimental and quasi-experimental designs, including randomized controlled trials. For applicability, meaning the real-world impact, their review proved that this genuinely reduces post-traumatic stress symptoms for victims. The validity is incredibly robust, and it essentially set the benchmark for exactly how we evaluate these programs today. Finally, for ethics, while it obviously empowers victims, researchers and practitioners absolutely must maintain strict vigilance about the risk of psychological harm, especially if an offender shows a lack of genuine remorse.
And hey, this modern data doesn't just exist in a vacuum. The evidence base literally spans generations. Foundational studies from the 1970s, like the Kitchener experiments in North America, and New Zealand's pioneering 1989 integration of youth conferencing have shown a consistent decades-long track record of high completion rates and victim satisfaction. So the evidence base here is incredibly robust and deep-rooted.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this synthesis question to ponder for your essays, particularly regarding the determinism versus free will debate in psychology. Restorative justice is entirely predicated on an offender's free will to actively choose to repair harm. But if some offenders lack that capacity, or if their behavior is shaped by deterministic factors they just can't control, can this highly cognitive, empathetic approach ever truly replace traditional prison sentences across the board? Or will it only ever be a complementary tool? Keep that in mind as you construct your final evaluations. Good luck with your revision and keep critically applying these concepts.